So my name is Dr. Simon Harding. I'm an Associate Professor at University of West London. So you'd like to know how gangs start? Well, it's a complex issue. Gangs have always been around. It's not a new phenomenon. What we find is that people group together or join a group of peers for a whole variety of reasons. Quite often it's for protection, because they feel under threat from another group, or they feel that their area, their community, their territory is perhaps under threat, and they feel they need to defend that, perhaps defend themselves against rivals, because they themselves have been intimidated or attacked. So quite often that's the original kind of glue that holds the gang together. And then maybe eventually over time, they move into criminal behavior. Not always. Sometimes the gang remains recreational or very much a kind of peer group arrangement. But there are many instances where the gang evolves into something different, becomes what we as criminologists might say more instrumental in terms of its criminal activity, where crime becomes an instrument for making money and money becomes the orientation. So quite often gangs start out as being what we might call involved in expressive crime, and that's a lot of very active, very dynamic behavior, antisocial behavior, things that can quite often piss off the community, things that are very visual, graffiti, vandalism, running around on BMX bikes, those types of things. But over time, eventually, many of them can move into making money, and the gang becomes a way of doing business. So when you look at London, there are certain areas that we would say are gang affected, or where gangs are prominent. Areas will be familiar to people: Brixton, Stockwell, Haringey, Tottenham, Hackney, Peckham in Southwark, a range of places that people will know. But what is it that links these places together? And the reality is it's poverty. Poverty and deprivation link these places together. You also have a certain level of young people, children and young people living in those areas. And over time, you find that these areas have suffered through austerity, through cuts, through lack of services, and particular community ways of being. The communities might have to be very self-resilient. They might have to rely on their own kind of community networks and community power. There might be an underground economy that people are involved in, a whole variety of things that bind that community together. And you may find that young people come together as well. And out of that, you have gangs sometimes emerging, starting, as I said, as peer groups, but then evolving perhaps into something different, where criminal activity begins to take place. In these estates, in these communities, there are a number of rules that anyone who lives there will know. Don't grass, don't snitch, don't trust the authorities, protect yourself, and come for anyone who's coming for you. They're the kind of rules that people in those communities understand long before they even enter into a gang. Once you enter into a gang, quite often those rules are amplified into something even tougher and even stronger. And when I interview young people who are gang involved, I sometimes say to them, you know, how easy was it for you to get into the gang? And they tell me that it's very easy indeed. In actual fact, it's a very simple step, quite a small step, because they've grown up in estates and communities where there are certain codes of behaviour, certain rules that they have to abide by. And a step into the gang is no big deal for many of them. They're familiar with the fact that they have to play the game by the rules, and they understand what those rules are because they've grown up around them. Sometimes they may have a family member who's been involved in criminal activity. The family might be involved in occasionally buying stolen goods that have come off the back of a lorry. That kind of thing is common in areas of poverty and deprivation. So I do find young people quite often have grown up in areas where criminal activity is perhaps more readily accepted, and also where violence is more readily accepted, even to the point where criminal activity and violence are the norm in those particular areas. So one of the key ways for people to get started in gang life is really through schools. We're all familiar with being in the playground where a certain group of boys perhaps are coming for you and you need a little bit of help and protection from your mates to back you up. We're all familiar with taking sides in the playground or at school, or being aware of a threat or somebody who's perhaps coming after you. And quite often we find that young people group themselves into crews or peer groups with a variety of different names. And from there, it can be very easy for criminal behaviour, antisocial behaviour to kind of take root amongst that peer group. It can also be very easy for different groups to become rivals. And sometimes those rivalries can turn violent, and sometimes those rivalries can play out outside the school boundary. And that is another location where violence can take place. Usually within the gang there's a structure that forms, perhaps younger people or youngers at the bottom, slightly older teens or olders in the middle, and then at the top people who are what we might call elders, who are perhaps a fair bit older, maybe even in their 30s, who are perhaps controlling business more than the others. But for younger people, aged between, say, 12 to 15, 12 to 16, their involvement in gangs can quite often begin at school. One of the things that fuels this, of course, is school exclusion. And young people whose behaviour, or their behaviour at school, has perhaps led them to be excluded. And of course, once they're excluded from school, they're out of the education system and they are effectively left by the state to run their own lives. And one of the things that becomes very attractive for them at that stage is to perhaps start running with a group who might be what we call in London on road, or people who are involved in gang activities. So in terms of recruiting people into gangs, young people who have been excluded from school, that's a very fertile kind of recruiting ground. So it's a key issue, I think, that needs to be addressed. As criminologists, we've quite often overlooked the fact that girls can also have involvement in street gangs. And it's really only recently in this country have we begun to consider what those roles might be. We've often been told or led to believe that girls can be very heavily exploited within gang culture, or within the gang game, as I might call it. And that does definitely happen. However, recently there are new ways of looking at how girls and young women are involved in gangs. Not all of them are victims. Some of them are perhaps victim offenders, and others are perhaps have more self-action, or what we would call agency, in terms of how they engage with the gang. So they're less of a victim and more actively involved, perhaps, than we had been led to believe. In terms of the gang and how it works, for me, I think young men really bring the violence. That's their key role for a lot of young men, is doing business and bringing the violence, or at least the threat of violence. For young women, they tend to climb the hierarchy within the gang in a slightly different way. They bring what I call social skill, and they use their social skill to elevate themselves up the rank of the gang. So they will perform different tasks. They may perform hiding guns, hiding weapons, hiding drugs, moving guns or weapons or drugs or money from one location to another. They will be tested, they will be trusted to do these kind of activities. If they fail to do them, then there will be sanctions taken against them. And rather horribly, some of those sanctions will be sexual exploitation or rape, for example, sexual violence. Other young women will perhaps perform different functions in the gang. They may even not be fully embedded in the gang. They may have one foot in the gang and one foot in other society, as we might call it. So they, for example, might be involved in doing things like transferring information or collecting information, doing surveillance on other gang members or on rivals, or possibly even handling money through banks, money laundering, hiring cars, helping the boys do things that perhaps the boys can't do, because the boys may by this point have an offending career history with the police or the probation service. So they play different functions, and they use their skills quite often in order to rise themselves through the ranks of the gang. We sometimes describe these gang-affected areas as abandoned communities, where there's been no investment, no money going into these areas. Youth centres have closed down, community centres have closed down. We're familiar with that. But what for me is very interesting is that quite often these are abandoned young people as well. There's been little investment in them. Perhaps their education has been terminated, they've been excluded from school, or they don't continue their education. They may perhaps be living in homes where they're experiencing domestic violence, and it may even be safer for them outside of the family home on the street. We may find that these young people are having violence or experiencing violence at home and in the street. That may be affecting their mental health. We have some young people who engage with drugs from a very early age, perhaps smoking skunk on a regular daily basis from the ages of 12 upwards. And again, that can lead to forms of cannabis psychosis. We have young people who perhaps have suffered a bereavement or family neglect, or perhaps one of their parents is absent or in prison or incarcerated. So we have complex family backgrounds. We then have a street world where there is violence as a normative part of world. So for many of these young people, they're growing up in communities where violence is part of their daily life. And when violence occurs, they don't have the opportunity, or they feel they don't have the opportunity, of raising those issues with the police, because one of the socializing factors in these communities is that you don't trust authority, you don't trust the police. So in terms of justice or access to justice, that's a very scarce commodity. Trust then becomes a very scarce commodity. So we find young people taking street justice into their own hands. And that again means more violence and violence on top of violence. So that also becomes an issue. So many of these communities suffer not only poverty but high levels of violence, and that involves a lot of young people. And what we really should be doing is finding ways to invest in these communities and invest in young people. When I interview young people who are gang involved, I say to them, what do you want? And they say one thing: they all want out. They want out of that life, that madness, as they call it, that constant, daily, stressful environment where they feel somebody is perhaps coming for them, or they feel violence is going to happen to them at any point, any time of the day. They want that to end. I've always found the young people I've interviewed to be highly intelligent, very dynamic young people who have got a lot of dreams and a lot of plans. And we should be investing in these young people. There should be resources in terms of youth diversion. We should have active youth projects, opportunities for young people to learn new skills, from computing to hairdressing to music production and video production, all of those things. There's simply not enough money going into any of this. But we need to work with the often damaged young people who are living in those multiply deprived communities and experiencing the violence. So that means opportunities for them to report crime, opportunities for them to improve their mental health. Those kind of activities also need to be considered. And we should be working with schools from a very early age, getting into schools and helping young people realize that there are ways to resist being pulled into gang life. I often call it the gang game, and I call it the gang game because it's a continual game that regenerates and evolves all the time. In some ways, you can consider the gang as being a little bit like a football team, where the players themselves change over time. They get older, they may leave, but coming up is a new group of young people who are already actively involved in the gang. So the game stays the same. The players change, but the game stays the same. What we find now is people are coming into the gang at a much younger age, and they're not necessarily leaving the gang as they get older. So you have younger people at one end, older people at the other end, and that just means more people involved in the gang. And that means more competition. It's going to be more difficult for you to raise your reputation and your status and reach the top. That means more competition and more violence. And this is a constant, regenerated thing for people, and it can be difficult to get out of. Well, in terms of change in the future, do I think things will change? I'm not sure they will. Gangs come from poverty and deprivation. And as long as we have that and we have inequality, then I think the conditions are going to persist. And where the conditions persist, the outcome will persist. So the symptom of those conditions really continues, and the outcome continues. So on that score, I'm not very hopeful unless there's a huge investment. For young people themselves, I think they can be very resilient, and just because somebody has been gang involved or gang affiliated or even involved in significant levels of violence, yes, I think personally there's an opportunity for these young people to come out of that. And I'm hopeful for young people in that regard because they can be very resilient, and they can go on and do other things.